One of the dominant themes in the Bible is how the weak overcome the strong with God's help. Esther illustrates this dynamic by how she channels the strength of others against themselves. It's a little bit of a judo move. She takes the opposing energy and she flips it back on its head. She knows that the king is emotionally volatile and easily swayed, and she uses that against him. She knows that Haman has this insufferable ego, and she plays on that in order to seek the salvation and deliverance of her people. So words and indirect influence are what enable Esther to act with great agency in a world where she is at a significant disadvantage. But remember, Esther means hidden. It's a play on the word hidden because she has to hide her Jewish identity. But it also points to the hidden providence of God, His sovereignty behind the scenes, working all things according to His good purposes. And so in that sense, she's never alone, and she's never operating alone. In Esther 7 and 8, we see Queen Esther exposing her hiddenness. She has to come clean with her identity. And in doing so, she places herself at the mercy of the hidden sovereignty of God. And so as the stakes rise, as the various threads of the narrative come into contact with each other, we see things come together in surprising and unexpected ways. This is Understanding Esther. In Esther chapters 5 and 6, the tension of the story heightens as Esther courageously approaches the king and makes a request. But she's a little coy about it. She doesn't actually come out completely saying, I need you to save my people. She says, I want to invite you to a banquet, and I want you to invite Haman. And this builds suspense and sows subtle seeds of doubt between Haman and the king. Meanwhile, Haman's pride erupts when Mordecai refuses to bow to him again, which leads him to construct gallows for Mordecai's death. And that night, the king is sleepless, and he happens upon a record of Mordecai saving his life and providentially commands Haman to publicly honor Mordecai in the very way that he wished for himself. So the proud is humbled, the humble is exalted, and God's unseen hand overturns the plans of the wicked. But the story is not over yet. Esther is going to make her actual appeal at the second banquet that she plans, again featuring both the king and Haman in chapters 7 to 8. And that sets the stage for the final turn in the narrative. So let's look at this in 3 episodes. First, Esther appeals to the king to save the Jews. Second, Esther and Mordecai appeal to the king to issue a counter decree. And finally, the king issues that counter decree. So we're going to talk a little bit about these in depth. So let's look at that first episode when Esther appeals to the king to save the Jews. So at the second banquet, and now remember, Esther has been insinuating that perhaps Haman is after the throne. And not only is he after the throne, but he's after the king's queen. He's trying to make a play for Esther. And this is in the background of the king's mind. And he starts to pick up on this because when he asks Haman about the man that the king delights to honor, Haman starts using royal language and seems to puff himself up. And it seems to affirm some of the king's suspicions about his desires. So there's already this budding seed of doubt there. And that's going to come to full bloom at this fateful banquet. So Esther appeals to the king. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. A couple interesting details in this dialogue. Despite the odds against her, Esther is very shrewd in the way she speaks. She frames her request first by foregrounding the threat on her life. She says, if it would be pleasing to you, I and my people are going to be destroyed. So she says, first, I want you to feel the personal connection. This is going to affect me, your queen. We have to remember that The king wants Esther to be this girl from nowhere. He doesn't know about her background, and that makes her an ideal candidate to replace Queen Vashti as Mother Persia, as Mrs. Persia, the representative of his diverse, massive empire. And if she starts to say, I need you to save my people, it begins to question her loyalty. And so she says, no, this is about the preservation of my life. I happen to be Jewish, and there's a decree against the Jewish people, and so that threatens me. So now it's personal for the king. She also makes this mention of how if the Jews were simply slaves, she wouldn't have brought it up. It's almost as if she's saying, look, I have the kingdom's interests in mind. If we freed a bunch of slaves, you would have lost a lot of your profit, and that's not what I want. I wouldn't be bringing this up to you unless it were a really serious thing. So she's playing to the king's interests. If she were to just, again, show up abruptly and say, save them, the king would be like, what are you talking about? Why do you care so much? And she'd be placing herself at risk. So she has to maneuver a little bit. She also buries the lead with regard to who the actual culprit is, it's a journalistic term when you delay the really important information to the end. And she doesn't start off by saying, Haman's out to kill me. She builds this story. She says, there's this decree. And by the way, the king is the one who issued the decree, but she doesn't make mention of that. She's trying to stay on his good side. And she doesn't make a moral appeal saying, this is a bad thing to do. She makes a political appeal. She says, someone's coming after me. I wouldn't bring this up unless it was a big deal. And at the end, she says, it's Haman. Haman's the guy. Haman is the person who is after me, your trusted advisor. Now, remember, again, the king's already paranoid. He's already had people who are close to him seek to assassinate him. So he's a little paranoid, and he already has his suspicions about Haman. So this is really that final push for him to really start to consider whether Haman has his best interests in mind. And Esther's saying, you saving the Jews is in your best interest. I'm only doing this with your desires in mind. Now, Esther realizes that the fate of the nation rests on her ability to maneuver in this way, in her given circumstances, with skill and prudence. Originally, the king thought maybe Haman was trying to take Esther away through adultery. But in reality, or rather in the perceived reality in the king's mind, he actually wants to do it through murder. He's trying to take her life away. And so the king is enraged and he heads out to the garden. One of the few times he's actually reflecting by himself without his counselors. And he's contemplating his next step. This leads to the next scene, when Esther and Mordecai appeal to the king for a counter decree. And that happens at the end of a sequence of events. The first being Esther and Haman are now left alone together. Now, Haman heard, or likely heard, all of this conversation between the queen and the king. And it seems like he's approaching her. And we don't know what he says, but Rabbi Foreman, who wrote, again, a great book on the book of Esther called The Queen You Thought You Knew. I've mentioned it many times, and I draw a lot of insights from him. He kind of speculates. Maybe Haman was saying, I wouldn't have issued that decree had I known you were Jewish. Sorry about that. This is an honest mistake. We don't know what he's saying. But providentially, the king returns and sees him on the couch with her in a compromised position and thinks, oh, he's trying to attack her in my very house. So now the conspiracy is confirmed. And the irony is, Haman is being framed for something that he didn't do, in the same way that he is framing the Jews for something that they didn't do. And so there's this ironic reversal in which the fate that he desires for someone else gets put upon his head. And of course, we're going to see that in full form when he gets actually executed on the very gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. There's another parallel. Haman's wife Zeresh was the one who counseled Haman to build the gallows in the first place. And now one of the eunuchs who are counseling the king gives the idea to say, why don't you hang Haman on those gallows instead? So there's a reversal there. So the appeal to the king comes with this further plot twist, right? At this point, Esther's plan has worked. The distrust is built. It comes to full fruition with Haman being caught in a compromised position, and then Haman's executed. So the bad guy is gone. But the story continues. It says that the king's anger abates. And you're wondering, Is he going, all right, I killed Haman. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Let's move on. But she's going, wait, that wasn't my full goal. I wanted the salvation of my people. And there's this haunting twist. The king's decree against the Jews cannot be revoked. It's almost as if the king is saying, I can't do anything about it. You're on your own. You got to imagine what it's like for Esther this moment. She's played her whole hand. She's come clean and said, look, she actually weeps in front of the king. She says, no, this isn't enough that Haman's dead. I can't bear to see the death of my people. Do what is right. She now makes a direct moral appeal, do what is right. And she is completely identifying with her people and saying, this is a pain to me. It's not enough that I be spared. I want all of my people to be spared. So here, she comes clean with the full truth. And then she finds out that that's not enough, right? You can't revoke the king's decree. Will Haman get the last laugh? But again, there's a moment of providence. The king looks at her and says, I can't revoke the decree, but you can write a counter decree, and it will come with my royal authority. And so Mordecai and Esther, they decide to issue another decree. And it is a decree that is an exact parallel to Haman's decree against the Jews. And it comes with the same royal authority. Haman called for the annihilation and plunder of all Jews, young and old, women and children. The counter decree allows all Jews to defend their lives by annihilating and plundering all attackers. Now, I want to set aside the question of the ethics of calling for this, and that's an important question, but for now, I want you to see the narrative function that this is playing. Rabbi Foreman writes this: Mordecai knows that if the Jews are to have any chance at all, his second decree must go toe-to-toe with the first. It cannot simply state vaguely that the Jews can defend themselves as best they can. Were it to do that, provincial governors throughout the land would weigh the two decrees and find the first more forceful, more specific, and thus more convincing than the second. They would conclude that Haman's edict represented the real mindset of the king, while the second decree was mere window dressing, issued simply to appease some political interest or another. You got to think about this politically. Why does it seem so violent? Why say kill women and children and plunder them? Because public decrees are statements about whose side the state is on. There's a public PR importance to this decree. And you'll notice that people are actually fearful of Jews. Some even pretend to convert to Judaism. Why do they do this? They're such a small minority. And both the decrees seem contradictory, but they're of equal force. What tips the scales in the favor of thinking that the state is behind the Jews in Persia? Well, Mordecai comes before Susa in royal robes and a crown. This is a signal that Persia stands with Esther's people. And that's why the Jews rejoice, and again, why many Persians declare themselves Jews out of fear. They know the state's position. They've seen the tide turn, and they adjust accordingly. So why does he issue a decree that mirrors the first one? He's got to say that this second decree is as serious as the first. And then what tips the scale to say that the state is actually behind the Jews is this public display of Mordecai's royalty. He's lifting him up. It's a very shrewd political move. Now, what are we to make of all this? Well, this is a worth good discussion in different small groups, and so there's many ways you can take this, but I think there is something intriguing about how Esther has to balance her two identities, her life as a Jew and her life as a Persian. She seeks the good of the empire, but she's subversive in a particular way because she knows her true home lies with her people. In a similar vein, Christians are exiles in this foreign land, in this foreign world. We all live as earthly citizens of a particular nation, and that's important, that's good, and there's an honor due to that. But we also possess a heavenly citizenship. And so we ought to seek the good of the church without dishonoring the earthly powers placed over us. But we must never concede our heavenly identity and citizenship for the sake of our earthly. At the end of the day, Esther reveals her identity. And we must be willing to speak about our faith, our identity, who we are in Christ, with tact and prudence, yes, but also with clarity. You want to be shrewd. You want to make sure that you are understanding the circumstances and reading the room. But there also has to be this courage to say, if it comes down to it, I will reveal who my ultimate allegiance is to. And that's the perennial question. Will we speak of our heavenly citizenship before earthly courts, earthly powers? And do we desire that the earthly powers would honor the heavenly realities of Christ and his kingdom? That's the question that confronts us today. And Esther, I think, shows us imperfectly, but I think powerfully, how no situation is lost, how God is working in the background, behind the scenes, through imperfect people to accomplish his goals and purposes. And we're called to act prudently and wisely in the present, to seek the good of the city, but also to remember that this world is not going to be the eternal state, and that there is a heavenly reality that demands our utmost allegiance.